from this point onward, your customers and your employees will expect you to be not just inclusive, but being authentically inclusive.
Thank you for joining me today, Francis. I'm super excited to talk about your new book. We love it so much.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
So I'm going to dive straight in. First question for you. What would you say to an organization that looks at inclusion as charity or as a way to check the CSR, corporate social responsibility box?
So if you want to be competing for the best talent in the marketplace, you really need to have inclusion as part of your company imperatives. Secondly, by having a diverse workplace and workforce, it really helps to drive innovation. And that will help really for you to develop, for example, different perspective about your product, about your brand messaging, about your services. Last but not the least is market expansion. When you have an inclusive workplace, they potentially will become a customer of yours.
Fantastic, Francis. And I want to zero in on one of the topics you mentioned around talent acquisition. So according to various studies, companies often say that their biggest challenge is the talent and skills gap when it comes to STEM specifically. How can inclusion help to bridge that gap?
As a country and also as company really have to be very creative in their talent sourcing strategies. So what better time to look at, population that historically or traditionally has been underserved. And this certainly include women, Blacks, or Latino, and so on. And specifically, of course, as you know, my work in the past 10, 15 years is with the people with disability and people who are aging. That too is a huge untapped talent potential that could be deployed into the STEM area.
One of the things that you mentioned at the onset of our discussion was, in addition to talent, market expansion. And so that presents really the other side of the coin around accessibility and authentic inclusion, which is another group of really equally important stakeholders, which are companies' customers, their consumers. I'd love for you to unpack just a little bit more what you mean by that.
When we talk about making, for example, a workplace accessible and hiring people with different abilities to come into the workplace to create that product, create that services. In the process, you're really enriching that delightful experience your customer is experiencing. And therefore, the customer loyalty or stickiness factor will come into play. So this is the kind of the essence of by being truly authentically oriented to your customer, you will make better customer, and then the customer will become better customer over time.
I'd love for you to dig more into the idea of designing for the extremes and really explain this in a little bit more detail and perhaps provide an example.
If we can design for people who are on the extreme spectrum, we ended up, we'll find innovation that's going to be applied for all. We all know the physicist Stephen Hawking, who recently died, and then of course, because of his disability toward the end of his life, he can only use his eyes to type, right? So this eye-gazing technology was developed to help him to still be productive in his later part of his life. And that same eye-gazing technology is now being deployed, for example, in autonomous vehicles. So the car is sensing whether your eyes is gazing on the road or you begin to doze off, or not paying attention, and that will trigger certain sensors.
How can organizations really prevent biases from being baked into their systems? And how can they also use technology to remove biases that may already exist in their technologies?
I have a phrase in my book, as technology gets more human, human needs to get more human. In that AI is actually being programmed by humans, right? And AI is made up of two basic foundational elements. One is a data set, one is logic or machine learning logic. But the programming of the logic is done by individual. So if the individual has a very narrow thinking or understanding or perception of the world, and that logic will be programmed into the AI. And that is where the unconscious bias can come in.
A really interesting example in your book that made a light bulb moment go off for me around insurance companies and how over the years it was discovered that there were biases baked into their systems. Do you mind just talking about that a little bit? Because it really connected the dots for me.
So the insurance company, basically, they look at, how the payment, of the insurance premium is really set on certain assumptions. And they just assume that, people who are kind of a lower income, are not as good a driver. They somehow made that connection. So therefore they charge a higher premium. By doing so, of course, they inadvertently, maybe it's unintentionally punish, quote unquote, the underserved, already poor population because they have to pay, much higher premium on their insurance. So this could just perpetuate this negative cycle of poverty. So it is very important that we are very deliberate and intentional to think about how to maintain the neutral state of a technology, which technology by itself actually is very neutral and can be used in a very productive way to, kind of get rid of the traditional bias. But that will only come about if leaders, especially the high-level decision makers, very conscious and aware, and making sure that you really have a diverse development team and design team, deployment team, and testing team to testing the 360-degree possibilities of technology like AI to ensure that it can stay, as fair, as trustworthy, and also as transparent as possible.
So we've talked a lot about the why today and why authentic inclusion is so important. But can you dive a little bit deeper into how organizations can really take inclusion from simply a core value to it really being core practice?
There are two basic tenets. One is a fundamental kind of a principle about respecting each individual can make a difference, not in spite of, but because of their difference. Because we have technology, it's even more important to have different diversity of people present and understand the usage and contribute to the design of the technology. On the other side of the authentic inclusion is how to operationalize it. Fundamentally, inclusion cannot be just an HR initiative or imperatives or HR program. It has to be a corporate-wide holistic imperatives, and that has to be viewed in the business context in order for it to have the sustainability. It's what I call the 6E framework. You have to have a senior leader like CEO, your board, or chairman of the board really embrace the idea of inclusion. But after you embrace it, you need to envision it. Be able to really, articulate what is your vision, what is your strategy. And then after you envision it, you really need to enact it, meaning you need to have policy and governance around it to make sure that it actually can be institutionalized throughout the rest of the organization. Then after you enact it, you really need to enlist it. Enlist meaning enlist people, enlist, resources. You got to put money behind it. Then after you enlist it, you need to enable it. You need to have education. You need to have training. You need to build up competencies, for example, in digital inclusion, in accessibility. But last but not the least is ensure, meaning you got to have measurements. You got to have metrics to measure your progression. That's the way to really make sure that authentic inclusion can be systematically and sustained and scalable inside your organization. So going forward, if we really want to build a just society, then this humanness, this human first thinking has to be first and foremost in the foreground. So digital inclusion has to be built into digital transformation.